Thank you all for being here. Thank you particularly for braving this horrible weather to come this morning. I'm very grateful to those of you who are here in person. Very grateful to those of you who are watching over the live stream, who perhaps were a little bit smarter and not braving the weather. And I'm very grateful to everybody who will watch the video of this event online in the future at their leisure. My name is Michael Strain. I'm Director of Economic Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm delighted and honored to welcome you to this morning's event, Securing the Transatlantic Trade Relationship. This event is being held jointly with the Institute for Free Trade, which is a wonderful institution that I encourage all of you to look into and check out. And I'm very happy to be partnering in a formal way with the Institute for Free Trade this morning. Canada and the United Kingdom have been the closest and strongest U.S. allies, and during the first Trump administration, important progress was made toward improved terms of trade. So far during the second term, there has been tariff uncertainty, but there are huge opportunities as well, including a tech prosperity deal with the UK, which is intended to lead to a comprehensive trade accord. This morning, we'll discuss the prospects for free enterprise, deregulation, and trade within the Anglosphere. The run of show for this morning is straightforward. After these brief remarks, I will invite Lord Hannan and Mr. Scheer to the stage, and we'll have a conversation. I'll ask them questions. You all should be thinking of your questions as well. They'll be taking questions from you. And there are instructions on the website for those of you who are watching this via the live stream to submit your questions electronically. Let me introduce briefly our panelists. Lord Hannan of Kingsclere is an author and columnist. He serves as International Secretary of the Conservative Party, as well as teaching at the University of Buckingham and the University of Francisco Marroquin. He has written 9 books, including the New York Times bestseller, Inventing Freedom: How the English-Speaking Peoples Made the Modern World. He sat as a conservative member of the European Parliament for 21 years and was a founder of Vote Leave. He is a regular columnist for, among others, the Sunday Telegraph, the Washington Examiner, and the Daily Mail. He is a member of the House of Lords, sitting as Baron Hannan of Kingsclere, and is president of the Institute for Free Trade. Andrew Scheer has been a member of Parliament a member of the Canadian Parliament since 2004. Mr. Scheer was the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada from 2017 to 2020. He served as the leader of the official opposition this year, briefly, I believe, as well. He was the 35th Speaker of the House of Commons from 2011 to 2015, making him the youngest Speaker in the Chamber's history. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage. Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
Thank you both for being here. I think we should start at the very beginning.
Very good place to start.
Lord Hannan, why is free trade something that we should desire? This is not a question that it would have made sense to ask in the 1990s. It's not a question that it would have made sense to ask in the aughts. But I think, at least here in Washington, we need a little bit of a back to basics conversation about these issues. And when I talk with people up on the Hill, when I talk with people who serve in the government, the arguments for free trade that would have been intuitive and bipartisan in the 1980s and the 1990s, in the 2000s, are no longer intuitive. And I wonder if you could start at the very beginning.
Yes, I mean, I'm not sure they were ever intuitive, to be honest. I think one of the difficulties we have is that free trade is quite counterintuitive, that the protectionist or mercantilist position seems to accord much more with our kind of caveman instincts, right? So if you say, whether from a far left position or from a NatCon position, we need to be self-sufficient, we need to grow our own food, we need to protect key industries, we can't carry on with trade deficits, we can't compete with slave wage economies, all of that sounds intuitive. All of it, when translated into policy, serves to make a country needlessly poorer. So to answer your question directly, Mike, what's the basic case? I would say, first of all, a moral case. It's fundamentally about freedom and property. something which, in other regards, conservatives tend not to question. If you want to sell me something, and I want to buy it from you, then the government needs a really good reason to come between us and to declare that transaction illegitimate. And the fact of you being in another country from me is not ipso facto to me a good reason. So first of all, there is that basic case starting from personal freedom and ownership rights. But then there is an obvious case, both in practice and in theory, that it makes us richer. In fact, free trade is probably the easiest and most cost-free way of raising the GDP of a country, because it doesn't really require the government to do anything, it just requires it to get out of the way. Countries that have opened their markets and have invited the traffic and commerce of the world have flourished, and countries that have protected specific privileged groups, groups that are politically connected or have strong labor unions or whatever, have tended to fall behind. Of course, those individual groups can benefit, but they benefit at the expense of everybody else. And this, of course, is why the dynamic in politics is always tricky, right? Free trade brings concentrated gains but dispersed losses. If the US were to abolish its steel tariff tomorrow, actually almost everyone will be a bit better off. You know, there are huge numbers of people in steel-using industries, car makers, construction, aeronautics, electrical appliances. They'd all be very slightly better off. They wouldn't know whom to thank. They probably wouldn't notice it. They certainly wouldn't change their vote. A handful of people in steel, directly in Dearborn, Michigan or whatever, would know exactly whom to vote. And so whom to vote for or against. And so the pressures on the policymakers are always different from a straightforward reading of the national interest. But free trade makes us freer, it makes us richer, and it also, I would say, the third leg of the stool, it makes us more peaceful. It doesn't prevent war. Sadly, man is fallen, and we haven't worked out a way to do that yet. But in societies where goods and services cross borders easily, there is less reason to start a war. It doesn't matter so much whose territory some resources are in, because you all have equal access to them. And the costs of engaging in a war when you're a globalized economy are higher. So in general, we saw after 1945 that the advance of free trade under the GATT and the WTO tracked very exactly with both a spread of prosperity and a spread of global stability and peace.
So I run, in my own personal life, a massive trade deficit with Amazon. Every day, it feels like, when I come home, I'm greeted by a stack of cardboard boxes. I never quite know what's in them. And in my entire life, I have never sold Amazon a single good.
Yep.
Your three arguments. The moral argument: why should the government jump in there and stop me and Amazon from conducting that relationship as we each see fit? Your economic argument: that arrangement presumably makes me better off and makes Amazon better off in an economic sense. And your security argument: I would not want to go to war with Amazon. I'm not sure if I did where our children's clothes would come from or any of the other stuff that arrives. I think are all very reasonable. It reminds me a little bit of the economist Michael Boskin's argument that we should allow free trade in all goods. Potato chips, computer chips, what's the difference? I think potato chips, computer chips, what's the difference, was a prevailing view in the 90s and is no longer a prevailing view even among proponents of free trade. And so let's say I accept your argument for nearly all international transactions. Are there reasons for resiliency concerns? Are there reasons for security concerns that the case you just laid out for free trade between the US and the UK might require some exceptions?
So I think your Amazon parallel is an extremely good one. Every one of you has a deficit with Amazon. Do you know what? Sometimes Amazon engages in dumping, right? Sometimes Amazon says, look, you've got X number of points, you can get a discount, or we've got a special Black Friday deal. Who gets the better end of that deal, right? Imports are a really good thing. It frees up your time and your resources to do other stuff with. But should there be these carve-outs? Should there be these security-based exemptions? Obviously, there are some national security concerns that are very, very particular and sensitive and that are excluded from normal politics. To the greatest possible extent, though, I would build a circle of friends where you have the advantages of specialization, comparative advantage competition in a wider market. And the US and the UK do that to a very large degree when it comes to defense procurement already. One of the bizarre things that happened in my country, where do I start with this government? But one of the really bizarre things is that under various kind of ethical ESG concerns, British pension funds were heavily discouraged from investing in British defense industries, with the result that a lot of those companies are owned by US funds, part owned by US funds, I should say, not entirely. There would be immense advantages in both sides if we were just to formalize what is in many ways happening at a lower level already and say, when it comes to defense procurement, every US company in Britain should be considered as if it were a British company and vice versa. And yes, you can have a reason to carve that out if there's a very specific concern, but that should be our default assumption. So I would do that. But I'd like to pick up, if I may, Mike, a bigger thing here, because I think lying behind what you say is a very reasonable and well-founded fear of autocratic economies. And there is a narrative out there that is very widely spread about China, and it goes something like this. We all made a huge mistake when we admitted China to the WTO in 2001. We all thought, runs the argument, that capitalism would make them more liberal, more democratic, more compatible with Western norms. In fact, those wily Chinese turned our system against us. They just got richer, but they still are as autocratic and unpleasant and revanchist as ever. And we've now simply given them the tools to defeat us with. That is broadly the narrative. And where I think that narrative really breaks down is it takes no account of the change in China that followed the accession to office of Xi Jinping in 2012. So actually, for the first decade of Chinese membership of the WTO, you did indeed see that correlation. China did become a more open society. As people became accustomed to choosing their mobile phone provider or their make of car or whatever, so they started to say, well, why can't I choose my mayor or whatever it is? And you did indeed see that liberalism, economic liberalism and political liberalism tracked. Where we went wrong was not in positing a false correlation, but in failing to see the power of the pushback of the old party elites. That when Xi Jinping took over, there was a massive crackdown. The emergent blogosphere was finished overnight. The independent journalists were put in prison. Then the lawyers who defended the independent journalists were put in prison. Then the lawyers who defended the lawyers were put in prison. Then everyone got the message, right? It was a very, very sudden change, which I think most Western observers, certainly this one, were very slow to pick up on. But that change has also accompanied a relative economic slowdown. If you go back to Maoist economic policy, to Maoist political control, you also get Maoist, or closer to Maoist growth levels. No one will want to invest in an economy where their enterprise can be confiscated like that by the state. And that is why, so actually, don't get me wrong, I'm very hawkish about China, but the reason that I'm hawkish about it is not because I think it's going to overtake us with some, brilliant new tech, but on the contrary, that it is the very definition of old men in a hurry, that they can see that for demographic and political reasons, the growth rates that they enjoyed during that first decade of WTO membership are coming to an end. And therefore, when we look at what should be our response, I actually think we should be much tougher When it comes to diplomatic and security responses, I think we should hit back in kind if we think we're suffering from cyber attacks. I think we should be incredibly tough on violations of the Hong Kong deal. We should be pursuing a very forward policy in the South China Sea, where all of these islands are being conjured from the vasty deep and turned into bristling forts and appearing brigadoon-like out of the mist and turned into airstrips. But I don't think that we help anyone when we reduce our trade. Because that's exactly what the autocrats there want. They want a more controlled economy. And the more internationalized the Chinese economy is, the harder it is for them to favor their friends and to assert control. In other words, sanctions of any kind, and if you like, not trading is the lowest kind of sanction, hurt the wrong people. They hurt the ordinary people in your country and in the other one. They drive support to the regime that you dislike, they create a siege mentality, and they make it easier for the tyrants to control the economy. We've seen that again and again. Sanctions did not bring down Saddam. Sanctions did not bring down the Ayatollahs. Sanctions did not bring down the Castro dictatorship in Cuba. Indeed, I remember the former Spanish Prime Minister José María Aznar telling me that Fidel Castro had actually admitted to him that the sanctions had kept him in office. Because he was able, this was Aznar's spin, not Castro, but he was able to blame poverty on the Yankee siege instead of on the uselessness of communism, right? So sanctions of any kind do not work. This is the paradox. If you fly from here to Peking, you're going to a country where apparently you have all the normal diplomatic courtesies. There is no sign that China is treated as an unfriendly power, except when it comes to trade policy, which strikes me as 180 degrees the wrong way around. We should be using trade to weaken the power of the party there. But in other areas, we should be much tougher than we're being.
Mr. Scheer, there was some important progress made on U.S.-Canada economic relations during the first Trump term. I wonder if you could say what you think are some of the best examples of that progress.
Well, to understand the Canadian context, the trade relationship with the United States is a constant recurring theme in our elections and in our political discourse.
I've noticed that.
Yeah. Going back to some of our first elections, John A. Macdonald with the Conservative Party back then, the Conservative Party was very protectionist, and it was, he called it the national policy, which was high tariff walls to incentivize a burgeoning industrialized central Canada. I come from Western Canada, and we bore the brunt of that throughout Canadian history because, to Lord Hannan's point, the dispersed cost kind of landed more on the exporting agricultural West. We then had an election in the early 1900s where back then we called it reciprocity. It was the word for free trade back then. And the idea was, and at that point it was the US coming to Canada, offering the reciprocity to drop tariffs, and we would then do the same. Now, if I could bring to 1988, Brian Mulroney, leader of the Progressive Conservative Party at that time, campaigned on free trade. He had that famous relationship with President Reagan, and it was very, very contentious. It was one of the more contentious elections that we've had, and I have to give Brian Mulroney a ton of credit because it was a very difficult argument to make. I think the point about the dispersed costs and concentrated benefits is so important, not just on trade policy, but domestic economic policy as well. And the losses, human beings are shown to fear losses more than to hope for gains. And it's very easy to go around factory floors and assembly lines and say, if those automakers in the US are able to sell in here, you're going to lose your job, you're going to lose your job. Well, who benefits? Well, some guy that doesn't even know he's going to benefit. Mm-hmm. Well, so I would say in the first kind of renegotiation of what we now call CUSMA, I think here it's USMCA, but in Canada we put the C first. In some respects, it was more a case of our government at the time fighting not to lose more access. I don't think it could be characterized as, from the Canadian perspective, as more liberalized relationship. It was more that the message from the U.S. administration was that the entire free trade deal was at risk, and so now we have to negotiate, and we were trying to preserve as much as we could in terms of access to the U.S. Like the U.S., Canada also has certain aspects of our economy that's not under free trade. We have some some like you do on agricultural policy, we have some similar things. But back then it was more, the deal is open, it's time to maybe address some grievances that each side may have had, and let's try to preserve this as much as possible. And although the message from President Trump at the time, at various points in the negotiations, as is normal, different leverage points, the prospect of losing the entire deal, once things start to progress, it started to be clear that, okay, well, there's not really an expectation that we would go back to the pre-free trade deals where we had no market access. This time, with what's going on, there is a sense of that fear. Like, have we permanently lost that tariff-free access to the U.S. market? And so I think right now, it's a very challenging time in Canadian politics domestically, but also with the relationship. And what's hard for us to understand, I think as Canadians in general, is when we look at our relationship with the United States, we don't believe that we are the cause of job losses in the Midwest, or in Michigan. I don't know that there are too many Canadian or companies in general that say, if we move our operations to Canada, we have some massive advantage across the board, because we have very similar labor standards, we have very similar environmental standards. Some input costs might be cheaper in the U.S. So the Canadian economy in relationship with the United States has really developed like niche roles in supporting the overall economy of the U.S. We figured out we could do some things better. We have some more affordable hydroelectric power in certain areas. And we looked at the various aspects of the Canadian economy and said, okay, well, we can grow something here by selling something to the U.S. that maybe they're not doing well or enough of. Mm-hmm. And so when we look at some of the political discourse in the U.S., where free trade is often difficult to explain because there is that prospect of job losses as imports start flooding the U.S. economy, we don't think of ourselves in that group of countries that's easier to blame. I remember growing up and watching the debates about NAFTA, and there's a lot of concerns about Mexico undercutting labor in the U.S. And I think
the giant sucking sound.
Yes, exactly. I was Ross Perot. Yes,
Ross
exactly.
That was from the south, not the north.
That's right. I would say generally our labor costs are probably higher in Canada and the U.S. So you're certainly not trying to undercut the minimum wage or the average hourly wage for manufacturing by moving to Canada. So our hope, I think most Canadians would say, our hope is that we can return back to what we had, and that would be the ideal. So it's a time of great uncertainty, and right now the relationship is, we had our Prime Minister say that he hasn't been in touch with the President for quite some time. But and I'll maybe close with this because I don't want to ramble on too much on the first question. But the benefit, I think, for me as a conservative politician, and not just as a politician but as a conservative who believes in free trade and free markets, is for Canada. I think back to that 1988 election, every single political party but ours was on the anti-free trade side. So many civil organizations and NGOs sprung up to fight free trade. And one potential positive outcome of this current trade conflict is that it's near unanimity now in Canada that free trade is a good thing. Mm-hmm. It really has brought, even the Socialist NDP party, even the left flank of the Liberal Party, it's almost universally now just accepted that Canada benefits from free trade. Free trade is a good thing, and we should be pursuing this. So I think long term, that might be one of the positive outcomes. Obviously, it's very negative right now, and there's a lot of job losses in Canada. So I'm not by any sense saying that this overall is a good thing, but that might be a silver lining that comes out of this, is it seems, at least for this generation, to have settled the debate on free trade in Canada.
Mm-hmm. That does sound good. Let's stick with, I think the future is a good place to discuss. Let's talk more about the near term future. We're here in the final month of the year. 2026 is less than a month away. 2026 is going to be a big year for U.S.-Canada trade and economic relations. You mentioned the Prime Minister hasn't spoken to President Trump in a while. I think they're due to see each other relatively soon. Yeah, I believe the FIFA World Cup lottery or something, they're going to be together. I don't. You call it football or soccer?
We call it soccer.
Okay, yeah. You could ask my 9-year-old; he would know more about this than I do. But I think they're going to be together, and they're going to have the opportunity to talk to each other. And obviously, in 2026, big renegotiation of the USMCA. What are your hopes for the near-term future of this relationship? What do you think is important for people in Washington to understand?
Wow, that's. I think honestly, I think the most important thing is that we are not a threat. We're not a threat to jobs. We're not a threat to investment. That if of any trading relationship around the world, the Canada-U.S. one, I believe, is very special because we're so close and because we share, basically a common legal system, common language. We have so many interpersonal relationships between individuals that it's such a complementary economic system. We grow when you grow, and the same would be true as well when the Canadian economy is doing well. There's more investment into the U.S. from Canadian companies. There's more tourists. Canadians can afford to go to Florida, and we call them climate refugees in our country. So I think the message would be, rather than seeing an auto plant in southwestern Ontario as something that's taking away jobs from the U.S., just for Americans to take a step back and say, yeah, we could all do that. We could all, put on the tunnel vision and look at one particular dynamic and say, yeah, if that plant wasn't there, those cars might be made in the U.S. But if you apply that thinking across the board, there's so much damage and the overall misery, even for those individual assembly line workers, overall is worse off. And I think that's the message, that as we grow, you benefit. As you grow, we benefit. I really do believe that of all the trading relations, I was doing some research for this talk, and I think the England-Portugal trade alliance may be the oldest, but in terms of the most complementary, the most symbiotic, it's really Canada-U.S. And we're really partners more than competitors.
People underestimate the stunning degree of economic integration. If you build a car, it crosses the border like 25 times on average, exactly. or something along those lines. Daniel, similar question for you. I believe there was just some progress made on pharmaceuticals between the United States and the United Kingdom. I know you're interested in the tech prosperity deal. Do you see signs of progress? Are you feeling optimistic about the year ahead?
Well, it's a very good question. I mean, the same dynamic applies that Andrew just identified in terms of being mutually involved with each other's prosperity. As, by the way, I think even President Trump implicitly admits when he says that all of this would be okay if Canada were the 51st state, right? So presumably the same people would be making the same stuff as now, but it would no longer show up as a trade deficit because it would be part of the US, and suddenly that's okay, which of course shows that deficits are not a problem, right? And his revealed preference shows that even he kind of knows on some level that deficits are not the problem that he claims. But in terms of what does this coming year hold? I mean, well, obviously a very big year for the US, 250 years old. For just over half of that 250 years, the US has been a close ally of the United Kingdom.
Kind of a rocky start.
Well, a rocky start, and it carried on being rocky. I think the last serious quarrel, appropriately enough, was over Venezuela at the end of the 19th century. But after that, the UK backed the American government in the Spanish-American War. The US government returned the favor in the Boer War. I mean, I've always thought it's actually quite an interesting question. Why did Germany twice declare war on this republic in the 20th century? I mean, it's particularly in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, it's always struck me as an unanswered question. What was Hitler thinking? He didn't even hold out for a reciprocal declaration of war by Japan on the USSR. Why did Why did he do that? And I think the only answer that I've been turning this question over and over in my head for about 30 years, and the only answer that I keep coming back to is because, like a lot of continental Europeans, he tended to see the Anglosphere as a kind of cultural continuum. He didn't really distinguish in the way that we do between the different component English-speaking democracies. And in his mind, same calculation as the Kaiser. Once you're at war with one of them, you're going to end up at war with all the others, so you might as well get the first mover advantage. And I think the fact of that alliance among our three countries and the other Anglophone democracies is actually what we mean by the post-war order. It's what we mean by liberal democracy. It's what we mean by an open society based on the rule of law, right? The precepts that govern relations among nations now, or did until very recently, date back to the Atlantic Charter signed off Newfoundland in August 1941. The idea that you can't just help yourself to a slice of a neighboring country when you feel like it. The idea that law must apply among nations as within them. The idea that democracy is preferable to military rule and so on. These are actually quite recent ideas in the scheme of things, but they were overwhelmingly developed in the language in which you are now listening to my words, right? These are we call them universal rights now, but because we're being polite. Right? Why did they become universal? You know, imagine that the First World War or the Second World War had ended differently. Imagine the Cold War had ended differently. There'd be nothing universal about them, right? From uncensored newspapers to jury trials, these were an Anglophone inheritance, and that's why I think this is about more than trade. I think the proximity of the democratic English-speaking Western countries is the linchpin of the entire global order, and I think we take that for granted, and I think we're going to miss it if it goes. So how do we strengthen that in commercial terms? We are getting there incrementally. You're right. We just signed a very positive deal, 0 for 0, on pharmaceutical products, which is of great benefit to both sides. We still have some of those complaining NGOs. Right? Donald Trump wants to buy our NHS, and sell it to his friends in the big pharma companies. And actually, I think all three of us, all three of our countries, have this issue of a certain kind of semi-populist domestic opposition that is both invincible in its certainty and remarkably uncurious about economics. So we have it with the kind of Euro nostalgists. They basically don't want a trade deal with the US because they correctly see that it will make it harder for us to have a close relationship with the European Union. Comparing the growth rates of North America and the EU, that to me is a no-brainer, but they're not worried about that. I mean, you during your leadership of the party, Andrew, had this whole issue with dairy and the Quebec and all that. And we all have these pressures, and of course, here, as well as those pressures, you now have this rather novel idea that we haven't had since Smoot-Hawley of trying to turn tariffs into a big revenue raiser, which history would tend to suggest is not going to be a successful policy. So, if you like, in all of our countries, we have this issue of the politicians looking at the powerful lobby groups, forgetting the point about dispersed gains and concentrated losses. And somebody has to take the role of saying, let's look at the national interests as a whole. And this is the thing that most puzzles me about the new wave protectionists here. I mean, what Andrew says about the polar switch is fascinating. I think the number of US Democrats that I now see quoting Reagan speeches on Twitter is, it is definitely the case that lefties are much more pro-free trade than they were pre-Trump. But the people who have suddenly emerged and who we never really heard of before the first Trump term, who are arguing intellectually for protectionism as a kind of a higher good in itself, I think what really puzzles me about their position is the way that they portray themselves as, on the side of the horny-handed sons of toil against the corporate suits. Right? And I've realized that for a lot of people, protectionism is just as much a vibe, a pose, as revolutionary left politics was. It's not really about the consequences. They're not really thinking, it's much more about what kind of person do I like to see myself as. I do not see myself as one of these rootless globalists. I see myself as a patriotic, rooted guy. And yet, if you think about it, I mean, how else to define the national interest economically other than the interest of the nation as a whole, as opposed to the interests of privileged groups who think that everyone else should effectively give them a subsidy through higher prices, which is what protectionism is. I mean, in a way, the fact that the left is coming round to this is a great return to their roots. The free trade cause, historically, from Adam Smith and David Ricardo onwards, was generally a progressive one. Right? It was the people who were for free trade were generally for containing the power of the monarchy, for abolishing slavery, for widening the franchise. And I think that was true right up to the 1930s. Protectionism was seen accurately as what it was, which is a racket whereby the poor subsidize the rich. And this is a very, very new phenomenon. And the way in which we will overcome it, I think, is by patiently and politely explaining that privileging a particular group of farmers or steel workers, or pick your group, almost always an old industry, right? It's almost always one that when we were preschoolers, we would see pictures of happy farmers or what. A call center worker doesn't have the same claim on our sentimental affection, but the privileging those groups always comes at a huge cost to everybody else. And if you really are determined as a politician to protect one of these groups, do you know what? Just give them the money directly. It is so much cheaper and so much simpler than messing up your whole economy by pushing up prices for everybody else.
Here in America, we do both. We protect them with tariffs, and then we give them.
I mean, I would rather not give them the money, right? I'd rather not do either. But in a world of lesser evils, which we politicians inhabit, right? We're often having to. This is a sublunary world. It's Aristotelian and not Platonic. We have to deal with the gross and not the idealized. A subsidy is about a 20th as expensive as an equivalent tariff because all of the revenue goes to the people whose votes you were trying to buy directly instead of messing it up with the whole country.
Can I pick up I just want to pick up a couple of things because I appreciate the perspective on that. And you are right. Every country has a few carve-outs. President Trump focuses on dairy. I was learning about the sugar beet industry in the United States. There's quite a lot of similarities.
They also received some special attention.
I read a book when I was learning about trade. I will confess that when I started my political career, some of the protectionist arguments maybe were seductive. I have a steel plant in my riding. I've some other manufacturing, and so when I really delved into it, I realized that some of the challenges we have on the free market, free trade side is that these ideas and these principles are kind of simple and old, and what we need to do is we have to just find new ways of making them relevant. And the book that really changed my mind on this was Frederick Bastiat's Sophisms of the Protectionist. And there's two thoughts in there that I really try to guide me when I try to explain things. And the one is that most people, or I'd say almost everybody, are producers of one or very few things. If you are an auto worker, you make one part for one part of a vehicle, but you're a consumer of many, many, many things. So you're far better off as an individual if you have access to the things you buy tariff-free or from a free market perspective. And so everybody wants the thing that they produce to be worth a great deal, and the things they buy to be worth much less, or cost much less, I should say. So I think that's something that we have to constantly bring the debate to. Even those people in some of those industries that might be what we call trade exposed, might run into some competition issues or challenges with free trade. Even those individuals are better off in the long term. And then the second thought, that to your point about you'd be better off just giving the check directly to the privileged industries or workers. The other point that Bastiat makes is human beings spend an tremendous amount of time, energy, and treasure to remove obstacles to trade. We dig holes through mountains and we excavate harbors and build bridges, all so that we can reduce the cost of going around the mountain or sailing to another part of the country. So we spend billions on port expansions and railways, and then when the trade benefits start coming in, the privileged few start to object, and well, we essentially put those barriers right back up with the tariffs. And his point is, you'd be better off not building the bridge.
Yeah.
You'd be better off just paying the carts to go the long way around, or don't build the tunnel. Then, because with the tariffs, you have the expense of building the bridge or building the tunnel, and then the cost of the tariffs as well. And just finally, what you said, I'm not sure. The one thing you said I might disagree with is on the educating politely and patiently, because that's what I've really learned in the last few years is Theresa May came to visit Ottawa after her election, and we were kind of discussing how we're fighting the same fights in the 2010s and 2020s as were being fought in the 70s and 80s in terms of free markets. And she made an observation that was very interesting to me. When I grew up, everything was NATO versus Warsaw Pact. The video games were all, us versus the Soviet bloc. The Bond movies all had, Soviet villains, and that was very much a pop culture thing. And we had this real world laboratory experiment of command economies, authoritarian governments, and free markets and democracies. And so as conservative politicians, we could easily say, oh, you want to give the government more control over this production or that aspect of the economy? Well, let's take a look at how that's doing in, say, East Germany. How's that doing in Poland versus in France? And so we were able to win these arguments. And then Theresa May said something back to me, which I thought was very profound. She said, yes, we won, and we thought that we had won the war. And what we didn't realize is that those proponents of Marxism, of socialism, they just went into different venues, and they went into the schools, they went into the universities, they went to academia, they started funding these NGOs and that. And what I think we lack, especially in Canada, I mean, this is a wonderful institute. We don't have a lot of this in Canada, where we have an ecosystem of organizations making the case to a new generation of voters, of consumers, of people for free trade and free markets. And one of the things I've been trying to do in kind of my post-leadership career is to do more what we call explainer videos, where you can take some of these lofty concepts like Bastiat and Adam Smith and make it consumable, so that people, when they're thinking about who to vote for in the next election, that they'll be more compelled to choose the free market party, or the party offering the most possibilities for that. In a way that's relevant, that they can understand, and we're seeing some success with that. But I would just say, the only part I disagree with you, we're Canadian, we're very polite, but it's the patiently part. I think we have to.
I take the correction. Fair point. And you're right. I mean, politics has to be a slightly didactic business, right? A candidate cannot simultaneously win an argument for something and position himself to be the beneficiary of having won that argument. Somebody else needs to win the argument, right? That it is expecting too much of a political party to expect it simultaneously to do both of those things. But I think that the real challenge we have is there's an internet meme which it's based on the last scene in a Scooby-Doo, where you're taking the mask off, and you're taking the mask off, and the mask is capitalism, and under the mask the real villain is the human condition, right? People have taken to blaming everything that they don't like on free markets. Even in countries like mine, where free markets have been, in retreat for 30 years. And one of the most extreme examples of this is this nostalgia for the mass workforces of the 1950s, and the idea that somehow, if America were autarkic, or at the very least, if there was no trade with China and Vietnam, that you could somehow live in these happy lives where one salary would support a decent family and buy a decent home and all the rest of it. But there is so much wrong with that. First of all, it's not true, right? It is based on some absolutely nostalgic, false ideas of what living standards were actually like. Johan Norberg, in his book on this, worked out that a full-time male car worker in Detroit at the end of the 1950s, the height of this nostalgia period, was earning slightly less than an Amazon warehouse worker today on the minimum wage. But of course, living much worse. He wasn't just he was earning a little bit less, but of course he didn't have the wiki, the Wi-Fi, the nice coffee, the cheap flights, etc.
Antibiotics.
Right.
Air conditioning.
Right. And the real Scooby-Doo thing here, it seems to me, is when people complain about the loss of old industries. What they're really complaining about is technological innovation. Right? Once a new machine or new form of AI or whatever it is comes in that allows one man to do the work of 100, it doesn't matter where that was invented. It's going to apply everywhere. Right? You can't stop the idea spreading. And I mean, to declare an interest, I do some work for a company called JCB, which builds diggers, which has been very much on the receiving end of some of these recent tariffs because they're made of steel. Yes, you could ban the diggers and have 100 men with shovels instead of one guy in a lorry, right? But very basic bastion. I hope we can all see that would leave us worse off, right? That doesn't stop being true just because the digger was invented in somebody else's country. Right? The same laws of efficiency apply, and that I think is really the argument that we need to make. It's going back and explaining. I mean, let me put it at its crudest, that jobs are not a benefit, that the benefit is prosperity, that the job is just a means to an end. Right? If we can live better working shorter hours, that's a good thing. Right? Having 100 men with shovels instead of the one guy operating the JCB is not a good thing. Yes, it creates jobs, but it does so at huge cost. And this leaving aside trade, this is the whole argument that Britain and Europe are using for this extraordinary green transition, where we are ripping out, for the first time ever, an entire kind of energy infrastructure and replacing it with a more expensive one, a less efficient one. And the argument is, oh, it is creating all these jobs. Yes, it's creating jobs, right? If you made everyone sit on a treadmill to generate power, that would generate jobs. I hope we can see that would leave us worse off because it would make everything more expensive and it would make us poorer.
3 quick observations from me, and then we'll turn to questions. First, I think you're both right. I think we need public intellectuals and writers to make the case patiently and persuasively. We need politicians to have a much more strategic approach to changing the law. I also think that we really seem to need to touch our hand to the hot stove. And Andrew, you mentioned that support for free trade is rising in Canada as actual free trade is shrinking. In the United States, support for free trade is rising as actual free trade is shrinking. And my hope is that we have our hand on the hot stove, our hand is being burned, our hand is still on the hot stove. When our hand comes off, we're not going to want to touch the stove again. And I think just like in the United States, as you mentioned, it's wonderful to see Democrats sharing videos of Ronald Reagan talking about the importance of free trade. I hope that we come out of this with a bipartisan consensus in this country around the benefits of trade that are much stronger, that was forged in the lived experience of this trade war. I hope the same is true of your countries as well. Secondly, in the United States, it is already the case that the average wage for a service sector worker is higher than the average wage for a manufacturing worker. And so the nationalists and populist politicians that want to move people into manufacturing jobs are arguing for moving people from higher paying jobs into lower paying jobs, which strikes me as absurd. And then a final observation. The elites in nationalism and populism seem to be very eager for other people's children to leave an air-conditioned store or an air-conditioned office and to stand in front of a 3,000-degree blast furnace. They don't seem to want to do that themselves. They don't seem to want their children to do it. Your questions. Please identify yourself by name and identify your institutional affiliation. Please do us the courtesy of framing your statement in the form of a question, so that if it were written on a piece of paper, it would end in a question mark. Dom. Oh, and please wait for the microphone for the benefit of the online audience.
Dominic Pino, Washington Post. Mr. Scheer, you have no idea how encouraging it is to hear that a politician has read Bastiat. In the United States, we've seen really the leadership of both parties turn against free trade for sure, and really free markets more generally. Whereas I look at Canada, and I see the Conservative Party has really held the line on free markets. I mean, you're a free market guy. The current party leader is a free market guy. Why do you think it has been the case that the Canadian Conservatives have held the line on this in a way that American Conservatives haven't?
Well, I don't know if I can speak to why the U.S. Dynamic, but I can certainly speak to the Canadian perspective. And I'll give our current leader, Pierre, is a free market guy through and through, and I believe that has been part of the strength of our party system. Is that in order to lead the Conservative Party, you have to be a member of the party. To be able to vote in that type of election. So you tend to get more ideologically involved members of the party. And so for a candidate to become the party leader, you really have to share those values with the overall movement. We call them movement conservatives in Canada. But I also believe it's because we have some of these examples in Canada ourselves. So I'll give you a quick example from my home province. For most of my life, there was this entity called the Canadian Wheat Board. And farmers in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and part of BC, if you grew certain types of crops, you had to sell to the Wheat Board. You had no choice. You couldn't sell to anybody else. And if you lived in Ontario and you grew the same types of crops, you could sell it to whomever, grain brokers and buyers. And so we've had, even within our own country, examples. We campaign on abolishing the Wheat Board to give those farmers in Western Canada the same choices as farmers in other areas. So I think internally we've also had those real world examples of where one province has a more regulated industry or aspect of the economy, or the federal government has imposed a double standard in certain areas, and we can point within to say, it's much better off when we have these free markets. So I can't really speak to the U.S. side, but I do believe that it's an incredible challenge every generation to restate these truths and to re-win these battles, and to take what Theresa May said to heart and say, we can never give up. You can never take for granted that my kids going through school are going to get a similar perspective on economics as I may have gotten. And the one thing about the hot stove argument is, unfortunately, human beings have this incredible capacity to forget pain. And it seems as a people, to your point about the human condition, we have to relearn these. I believe we'll come out of this period with more resolve for free trade, but I would predict that probably, again, within my lifetime, the protectionist wave is going to come back. So I really do want to stress that importance of education, of bringing these free market ideals, talking about the absolute enormous benefits for prosperity. Capitalism has lifted, free market capitalism has lifted so many people out of poverty. And when we talk to progressives in Canada, or lefties or socialists, they all try to wrap up their ideas with pure motives. They say, well, we want to help this low-income worker, we want to help this new Canadian, this immigrant that might not have same language and skills. Well, what does that better than free market capitalism? There has not been a social program invented or a government policy invented that can replace the effects of willing seller, willing buyer, people staying up late at night trying to solve other people's problems. The beauty of that is free market capitalism is, for me to make a buck, I've got to solve your problem. And I will wake up thinking about that problem, yes, out of some self-interest, but the selflessness of free market capitalism, I think, speaks to the values that the left claim, but don't never matched the outcomes as conservative free market policies.
Can I make one observation? Not to presume to speak for the US, Dominic. You know, because you've written brilliantly about this. The size of the US economy means that trade is less of a big deal. Right? If you are the biggest economy in the world, and almost all of your GDP can be accounted for domestically, you can sustain a really bad trade policy and offset it with a moderately good policy on taxation, deregulation, and energy abundance. And that, broadly speaking, has been happening. Now, we can see the ill effects of the trade policy. We see it in the empty container ships. We see it in the specific job losses in the industries that are affected by the now suddenly more expensive imports. But that is to some degree mitigated and may, over the course of the entire term, be swallowed up by the impact of fracking and deregulating and so on. And that's the danger of the burnt stove, the burnt hand on the stove. Because if I'm right that free trade is basically counterintuitive, then actually you do need this regular experience. And of course, we had one in the 1930s. The US had one big time in the 1930s. And it burnt its hands so badly after the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, which took a stock exchange crash and turned it into a global depression, that afterwards, even during the Second World War, the leaders of the free world got together at Bretton Woods and said, how the hell do we make sure that this doesn't happen again? And that was the birth of the post-war trading order, and it worked. Now, very few people can remember any of that, and that's why I think we're going to repeat it. How does Kipling say it? The dog returns to his vomit, and the sow returns to her mire, and the burnt fool's bandaged finger goes wobbling back to the fire.
Good morning. My name is Jörgen Warborn. I'm a Swedish member of the European Parliament. I'd like to pick your brain on WTO, because, of course, 2026 is a big year for WTO as well. We have the ministerial coming up, and I think we need to show some love for WTO at the moment. I'm not very optimistic.
You feel it's inadequately loved?
Yeah. I'm not very optimistic, though. Because we need, of course, to change the way we take decisions in WTO. We need to address the China situation and the countries that do not play according to the rule books. And my impression is that we have had a lot of issues with India, South Africa, a number of countries, Indonesia. But now also we have US on the side, where I do not know if they are playing together with the free trade agenda or not. So what's your take on WTO issues?
I agree completely, Jürgen. I could see a scenario where I was amazed to discover the other day that the League of Nations still exists as a legal entity, paying out the last survivors' pensions. Right? The bureaucracies are never abolished, as we know. They never say, "Oh, job done, great. Let's go and do something else."
Ronald Reagan,
right?
The closest thing to eternal life we'll see on this earth.
Exactly right. But I have a horrible vision where that is the future for the WTO, where it stops doing anything and just sort of exists to pay salaries and pensions, and. You were perhaps too polite to say this, but actually the US has a worse record when it comes to infraction than China has. With all of the problems of China, all the stealing of intellectual property, all the reverse engineering, when China is told to do something by the WTO, it is more likely statistically to take remedial action than the United States is. And that, I think, is a quite serious challenge for us. So I think we need to go back. We can't pretend that we can make all this work if the two biggest economies in the world are not playing ball, right? We need to go back and win the arguments again, and we need to do that here above all. I think it's possible, right? It's happened before. It happened under Reagan, and it's going to be up to organizations like this one and people in this room to make it happen. But if it doesn't, if we see a repeat of Smoot-Hawley, and if we see the US retreating into autarky and relative poverty, and with that, the end of the international system that always rested as a stopgap on a willingness in this country to deploy proportionate force in defense of freedom and the global order, if that goes, then a lot of the people who are now campaigning against it are going to really wish that they had it back, because the future is not the one that they envisage. If the hegemony of this country and its allies and auxiliaries is ended, the people who are going to step into that gap are not the kind of touchy-feely, let's respect the sovereignty of every Venezuelan and Palestinian fantasy of the protesters. There are some really brutal, unpleasant autocracies waiting slavering quite openly to take that role. And a world in which their values are the dominant ones is not going to be as warm and cheerful and brightly lit as this one.
I want to respect everybody's time, not least of which the two gentlemen to my right. We started a little late. We've gone a few minutes late. Let me take moderator's prerogative first, and then extreme moderator's prerogative second. Moderator's prerogative will be to ask both of you to make concluding comments. Extreme moderator's prerogative will be to determine the subject of my friend Daniel's concluding comments. Andrew, anything you would like to say? Any closing message to our audience here in Washington? And then Daniel, it would be wonderful if you could tell us what needs to happen to get a U.S.-UK trade deal.
Well, I guess my concluding remarks would be to reinforce the appeal for free markets as not just a benefit to domestic economies, but also to help with the fight back against the wave of protectionism. I wish in my own country when the president started to raise the specter of across the board massive tariffs of 25%. It's understandable why the debate took on the flavor it did about reciprocal tariffs as leverage in negotiating, and I'm certainly not going to get into those level of weeds. But what I found was missing in terms of the debate was, why not use this opportunity to make Canada 25% more competitive? Why not use this to sharpen our minds and say, okay, if the U.S. is going to ultimately hurt themselves in the long run with tariff policies, imagine Canadian companies getting 25% more productive, more efficient. Our ports, our railway systems have some archaic things about them that take a big bite out of competitiveness. And I believe that when you look at the countries around the world throughout history that have had very liberalized trading policies, Singapore today, Great Britain at various times in its history, other countries fight to get in when they see the untold prosperity, the massive amounts of prosperity and increase in quality of life. And I think if members of the WTO, if Canada right now, if we had that part of the lens applied as well, saying, yes, it's important to negotiate some of these things and settle much of it at the negotiating table, but meanwhile, let's use this as an opportunity to cut through some of that red tape, to look at those bureaucracies that don't provide value to the citizens but just layer on costs, and then we'll come out of it even stronger, and companies will be fighting to get into Canada to make foreign direct investment because we've become so much more efficient and productive. So I guess that would be my message: is we can never stop making the argument for free markets, because so many privileged groups and elites and special interests fight against it day and night, and they really seep it into pop culture, into the education system, and we can't be missing in that fight. So the more that you can do, this institute, the more that politicians can do, and other believers in free markets, we have to engage in the debate, and especially around young people. I'll close maybe with this. I take a look at what my kids are getting home from school, and if you have children in schools, I would please encourage you to do that, because we spend so much time around the dinner table just undoing the damage that's been done in the classroom.
Re-education.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. I had a question once from a student I was speaking to school, and talking about income inequality and gap between rich and poor. And I think it's the human condition is real, and we have to think of these things. But I think Margaret Thatcher had the best solution answer to this in her final question period, where she was asked this very question from a Labour MP about the income inequality at the end of her term versus the beginning of her term. And she said, well, the honourable gentleman's policy he would rather the poor were poorer as long as the rich were less rich. And so anyway, I explained this to the children, kind of led into this overall diatribe about free market economics. They were very attentive, but they were also very amazed. And it struck me in chatting with them informally afterwards, that was the very first time they had heard some of these arguments, some of these ideas and principles. And I'm not sure if I changed all their minds, but it was fascinating for me to realize, oh my goodness, people can go 20, 25 years into their life and never be exposed to a quote from Bastiat or Adam Smith or Margaret Thatcher. So I just think we need more of this.
Absolutely right. And also a complete lack of perspective about what was there before, right? So it should be the most basic small c conservative thing to be able to appreciate that although this world is necessarily imperfect, and although there are lots of things in it that we would change, tearing everything up in the hope that the pieces might fall randomly in a better way is generally not a good strategy, right? I think that understanding is the basis of what makes you a conservative and not a revolutionary. It's that we appreciate that which has come down to us is a collective endeavor that could not have been built by any single generation on its own, and we have a repairing lease on it, if you like. So to come to Mike's question about what should happen, look, I'm strongly of the view that you have to win this argument in practice rather than in theory. Because for all the reasons that we've already discussed, free trade in theory is very difficult for most people to grasp intuitively. Not if they've taken the time to read Bastiat and whatever, but most people don't. Right? In fact, a general problem with free market ideas is that in an age where the average time spent on a TikTok video is 7 seconds, we are at a disadvantage when trying to make a counterintuitive case. For example, arguing that rent controls mean that rent doesn't actually come down, or arguing that you can cut the tax rate and get a higher tax revenue. These things are, with 5 minutes you can explain them, but people are not giving us those 5 minutes now. And I think free trade is in that category. So the only way really to win the argument is to show that it works. And in countries where that has happened, generally a new consensus develops around it. So it happened with Singapore and Hong Kong in the late 20th century. It happened more recently in Australia and New Zealand. Indeed, as Andrew said, happened in Victorian Britain. It is jeopardized when there is a protectionist attack from outside, because people's Paleolithic retaliatory instincts overtake their sense of what delivers prosperity. And that broadly was why Britain began to retreat from the free trade, which had made it the richest country in the world by miles in the early 20th century. The argument again there was reciprocity. Oh, the Germans are doing this to us, the French are doing this to us, the Americans are doing it. Incredibly bad argument, but human nature being what it is, a sort of inescapable part of the condition. So this is why you just have to show that it works. Now, this brings us to the US-UK deal. If from a Trumpian perspective, you were looking for the country with which you could most easily do a trade deal in your own terms, it is difficult to think of a better example than the UK. The UK, very unusually, does not have a trade surplus with the US. Our figures show us having a tiny surplus. US figures show the US having a tiny surplus with us. It sort of comes down to really technical things like whether you count gold bullion transfers, but it's basically in bounds. So that fundamental bizarre sense that the president keeps repeating and that nobody wants to correct, which is that a trade, in fact, not just that a bizarre thing that Trump is arguing, not just that the US shouldn't have a trade deficit, but it must not have a trade deficit with any of the other 200 countries in the world at any time, which is a kind of an odd thing to argue. But anyway, especially odd when wanting more investment, but we'll leave that to one side. If there is a country where that doesn't apply, it's Britain. Lots and lots of cross-investment for all the obvious reasons. We have the same legal system, the same language, the same accountancy rules. A lot of our professionals cross back and forth. And in fact, where it's non-governmental, very often we've already reached deals on mutual recognition of credentials, things like architecture, right? Where the two professional associations can do their own deals, they tend to do it. It's the ones where there are state or federal jurisdictions here where it's been a bit slower. Trump recognized that logic in his first term. And actually an awful lot of progress was made towards what would have been a very impressive and comprehensive deal. But our timing was always wrong. We were the ret and scarlet of the global commercial scene because at first, after Brexit, Britain faffed around trying to decide whether it wanted a trade policy at all. Theresa May kept hankering after staying in the customs union. When Boris came in and said, actually, yes, of course we want this trade deal, he came in December. He won the election in December 2019, and COVID hit 3 months later. Despite COVID, quite a lot of progress was made, but we hadn't finalized the deal when Biden came in and said, we're not having any trade deals with anybody. Full stop. And he meant it. There were none. Now, of course, we have Trump But we now have a Labour government that doesn't want to diverge from EU standards, and so it's complicated. Nonetheless, the gains are there, right? We've got all the cross-investment. We haven't yet had the trade, because for a long time, trade in the UK was controlled from Brussels, and the kinds of things where we have the most to gain, particularly in services, the EU was generally not interested in discussing with the US. So there is that potential there. And I think it may happen. But it will require both sides to move a little bit. The essence of the deal, Britain has a very open attitude towards services and financial services. The US does not. Getting more access for British financial services, legal services, shipping, etc., is a big potential gain, but is complicated by the fact that a lot of that is state jurisdiction and requires talking to the 50 state governments. On the other side, the big political gain here, I don't think it's a huge economic gain, but it's the one that the politicians like, is Britain is a big food importer, big economy that grows very little food. We haven't really produced enough food for ourselves since about 1720. And that is of interest. And I have to say, so far, in all the conversations I've had with the producer groups here, they've all been remarkably realistic about understanding how to get to where they want to be, which is a gradual opening of the UK market in a way that isn't going to lead to a derailing of the entire trade talks. So something may happen, right? And I think that the fact that this farmer deal was announced yesterday shows that the rounds are still taking place, the negotiations are still in effect. Why should this be of interest to those of you in the room from Canada or Sweden or wherever, those who are not British or American? Because you establish the bridgehead, right? If you can make one really effective free trade agreement with this country work, it is much easier to argue for the next one and the one after that and the one after that. So my hope is that a strong US-UK bilateral FTA will make it much easier to have a bilateral between the US and the European Union, for example. It's obviously hugely in our interest. We want to have rich neighbors, right? We want them to be good customers, and we like them anyway, right? But it's a step towards doing all of these other deals. And I think if you start with, as I say, the countries where that is easiest, Britain is probably the easiest. There isn't competition in any of the things that Trump worries about, and our energy costs are so high that we can't conceivably outcompete you at steel or other energy-intensive industries. I think that is the beginning. I'll close with a little, since we're doing Bastiat quotes and things that our children should learn. This is my favorite one. It's actually from Henry George, but it's such a neat demonstration of the folly of the protectionist cause. When we're at war with another country, why do we blockade it? Think about this, right? What are we seeking to achieve when we try and close the enemy's ports? Right? We're trying to make them poorer, yes? We're trying to deprive them of the supplies they need. We're trying to put them under pressure, yeah? Can we all agree that we're not trying to nurture their infant industries? Right? We're not doing this to try and make them more competitive in the global economy, right? Tariffs are a way of doing to yourself in peacetime what you do to the enemy in war.
Recognizing that tariffs are taxes, I too will close with a quote from President George W. Bush. It's important to cut the taxes. Let me thank all of you for braving the elements to be here. Thank everyone for joining online, and let me thank especially Mr. Scheer and Lord Hannan for this insightful educational conversation. Thank you all.
Thank you.